Indeed. All right, everyone, I think we're going to get started. So thank you, everybody, for coming. This is the third of our Literary Agents annual meetings, and we're delighted to have you here today. My name is Mark Jones, and my co-host is...
Ashley Polasek.
Yeah. And today our theme is Annotations and Adaptations, and we're going to do this a bit like we did last year, where we're going to have two halves to the meeting. The first half is going to be a panel discussion, and in the second half, we're going to pass it over to Ashley to talk to our special guest, Charles. So I'm going to start by talking about the annotations with a group of experienced annotators we've got with us today. So I'd like you to introduce yourselves, panel. So Anna, if you can go first and tell us what you've been working on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to. My name is Anastasia. I mostly present myself as an academic. I work on 19th century science and literature. And I think what I've been working on, you're referring to the annotation of the King of the Foxes that I did for Ross Davis's press. Other than that, I've been working on a number of different pieces for the various BSI professions books and other titles, none coming out in this year, but a number coming out a year from now.
Brilliant. Margie?
Oh, hello, Margie Deck here. The only thing I'm doing is the Blue John Gap project for the Arthur Conan Doyle Society at the moment.
And you're joined in that project by Nancy?
Hi, I'm the evil twin of Margie. We're working on the Blue John Gap project, and what this is the Dartmouth College original manuscript of Terror of Blue John Gap by our man. We're allowed to put the pages up and have annotations about the separate pages. So that's what we're doing.
Brilliant. And last but not least is Phil.
Hey, Phil Bergem from the the Norwegian Explorers of Minnesota. I've been involved in the Baker Street Irregulars manuscript series. The latest edition, the 12th one, is out this weekend. I'll show that in a moment here. But yeah, so I get the opportunity to do transcription of the manuscript for the stories and then annotate it, and it's greatly fun. But here's the latest one, the Haven Horror. Not coming through all that great, but exciting to see it in 3 dimensions instead of on PDF.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And you've all been approaching annotations in different ways. But I was going to start with maybe Margie and Nancy, because your project's live at the moment, and it's a live project, which is an interesting way of approaching annotations as well. So tell us a bit about how you got involved in annotations and why you wanted to get involved in this aspect of scholarship.
Who's going first?
I'll go first. Well, Ross Davies asked us to do it, so that was the first step. And we had co-edited a book called Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street. Some of you are in it. And we worked so well together, and we loved the little nippery minutia, kind of how you have like the manuscript and then you pop off and get a little more detail about something else. And I own probably all of Les Klinger's annotated manuscripts for different genres. I just use new annotated Frankenstein. So the idea of annotations was kind of in Margie and my wheelhouse. And we both love the Terror of Blue John Gap. So that's how we got involved. Take it away, my friend.
Well, at the time, this was back in 2021. I'm always late to the party. I was just starting to read Doyle's other work beyond Sherlock Holmes. He really was out there. And I really fell into the Gothic stories, and I just fell in love with them. And then I followed that in my little 2-person book club. We read A Life in Letters, and then we read Teller of Tales, and then I went back and read them both. And so I was just hooked on this guy that had kind of become real to me. He had just been a man who was, that silly man who was fooled by the fairies, or, he was the literary agent. And this reading made him a real person. And I got really interested in his work and how he worked. And right at that time, Ross Davies just turned up with this fun little project that gave us an opportunity to really get down in the weeds and see how he works. And I've just had a wonderful time with it. So that's what we're doing, down in the weeds. So,
Down in the weeds. And Anna, I think King of the Foxes was another Ross Davies associated project, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. So Ross is just one of those people who is always juggling about 10 different projects, and I'm not quite sure when he sleeps. But yeah, he called me up one time, and because this is what he does. He emails you and says, "Can I call you and talk about a super secret project?" And you say yes, and then you pick up the phone. And so he asked me to annotate a story by Arthur Conan Doyle called The King of the Foxes, which was written a few years before The Hound of the Baskervilles, and which actually I think has some similarities. You know, there's the legend of a gigantic hound, there's the legend of a gigantic fox that no one can catch. You can see the similarities. And so he wanted to do this coffee table book with some essays. Ashley has an essay in it. And he wanted me to do the annotations, which, you know, I said, yes, I want to be in a beautiful, beautifully illustrated coffee table book with a number of other wonderful Sherlockian scholars, which was a delightful experience. I learned so much about, you know, grain imports into the UK in the late 19th century and the development of barbed wire, which was invented in America, and all of these other very, you know, kind of esoteric facts. So it was a wonderful experience.
Yeah. And how did you approach the business of doing the annotations, Anna? And we'll maybe come on to Phil after this on the same topic. You know, what was your sort of strategy for doing it?
Well, so I started out by asking Les Klinger for advice, because he was doing a panel at something or other, and I just sort of asked him, if we wanted to annotate, what's your advice? And he said something like, you know, start broadly, read broadly, you know, start with a big scope, and maybe afterwards you narrow it down. But when you start out, don't have a laser focus. And I thought that was wonderful advice. So I've read through the story, you know, I read through the story, I guess, a few times. And, you know, I have the kind of mind where when I read, it just makes connections. You know, I read a line and my brain says, well, that's similar to like this other text you might have read, or this is around the same date as this other story that has relevance. So I read it and I just let my mind make all of the connections for me and kind of wrote them down, and maybe underlined some things that I didn't understand. Like, again, there is a small barbed wire kind of reference there. Barbed wire is important because if you use it to like block off your fields, then when you're chasing after a fox on horses, barbed wire is, you know, bad. It will damage the horse that tries to jump over it. So development of barbed wire, very, very bad for fox hunting. So I just sort of underlined all the like little things that I wasn't sure about. And if I'm not sure about it, then a reader reading this would maybe not be aware of this kind of historical context. And I knew that I would need to kind of have an explanation there. And then I did the thing they gave me a degree for, which is all of the research and going down the rabbit hole of, you know, things behind paywalls.
Yeah. And Phil, you've probably looked at more manuscripts than anyone else on the panel, I think, because how many have you been involved with now, and what's your approach?
I'm in the 13th one right now, for next year's book. So the approach I take is I first of all, I find a decent electronic copy online, and then because I start off with the transcription first of all, so that in the book we do I do a very accurate transcription with crossouts, insertions, the way that it's punctuated in by Doyle, and he didn't like using commas or periods. He left that for his typist or his editor. So I start off with creating the transcription, also the line breaks and stuff like that. And then I print out a paper copy of each of them. And I do like comparing it to the two periodicals, the Strand magazine and whatever, excuse me, whatever it was in the US, Collier's or whatever, the first British and American book publications, and then also the standards that are recognized by many, the Doubleday edition and the John Murray edition. So I compare it to those three, and it's surprising what some of the differences are.
Yeah.
But I wind up reading through the story word by word, and sometimes, character by character, 6 times at least, 7 or 8 as well for a couple other, going through. And I'll make notes of things that just catch my interest. What sounds interesting, kind of like what Anna was mentioning, is your mind reads something, goes, oh wait, I recognize that this is something that Conan Doyle did in his life. So I kind of make notes of, come back to those a little bit later on. A lot of the annotations, as I say, are when words change, if they Americanize spelling. A lot of times in the Collier's edition, especially when they get closer to the end of the story in the back pages, they'll maybe take out a couple sentences or sometimes even whole paragraphs to be able to fit it on the page. Oh, they don't want to go to another page here, so let's get rid of these words that I, as an editor, feel are superfluous.
Yeah.
So
I feel
and
like sorry, Phil, go on.
Go ahead.
I was going to say that your approach is much more like a sort of in academic circles, you've got the scholarly editions of volumes where you're trying to get to the core text and and trying to get back to the essential, what was written by Conan Doyle, how it then gets translated into different journal articles and different presentations as well. I mean, I'm always amazed by how little punctuation Conan Doyle has in his manuscripts. I don't know if you've seen that as well. I mean, he seems to have a complete aversion to commas.
I can confirm, having annotated King of the Foxes, it's not just a Sherlock Holmes thing. This man is not on good terms with punctuation.
I think it's because he was such a natural storyteller. He's just writing as quick as he can to get down, and he says, I'm not going to bother with all this stuff and going back to check it out again. I've got other people who can do that.
Yeah,
I think he just wanted to get it out, get the thoughts onto paper as quick as he could.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that's what gives it it's that immediacy of his writing. It gives credence to that, to his own statements that he would write at speed. And it's quite interesting sometimes where I looked at 5 of the Gerard manuscripts just before lockdown, and they're in the British Library, and the only thing that you see there is occasionally you get like half pages ripped out of a manuscript, and he just pastes in something else, which is clearly written at speed, on another sheet of paper, and he's gone back and just stuck that over the top. But it'd be really fascinating to know what he'd actually got rid of originally. But I was just going to say, Margie and Nancy, in terms of your approaches, is not the sort of textual scholarly analysis of the text. You're going down a completely different route, and you're also involving more people in it. So tell us a bit about your approach to the Blue John Gap project.
Well, we kind of are taking more of a popular culture approach, I'd say. In writing, you have what there is, and then you find something new and you synthesize it. So we're trying to find people sometimes outside of our usual suspects that our Sherlockian group, people who know about something that's in the manuscript, who may not necessarily be a Sherlockian, but it will bring in information for us in our world that's new or that has a different approach. And one of the examples I'm thinking of is one of my former students, because I used to teach in a graduate creative writing program, is now a well-respected writer of Persian science fiction and fantasy. So we went to him, his name is Peter Baravesh, and asked him to write about 1001 Nights, or the Arabian Nights, because it's mentioned in the story. And so he brought us up to date. And actually it's very interesting because we can argue that science fiction began in the Middle East. So that's cool. And that's new and different for us. And so that was one of the things that we try to do, is bring in new information and new perspectives to the Sherlockian group. So that's one thing we're really interested in.
Yeah.
Take it away, my friend.
Well, I would just say we're also interested in opinion a little bit, since we're taking this popular culture road. An example of that was I kind of got off into a phrase that was in the story, because they're talking about our Dr. Hardcastle was a doctor who was devoid of imagination. And that phrase really stuck with me. And I got to thinking about doctors and imagination. Do we want them to use their imagination when they're treating us, or do we want them just to be scientific? And anyway, so I had all these questions, and in the end, Robert Katz wrote us an absolutely beautiful piece about doctors and imagination in the work. And if you haven't seen it, go find it on the webpage, because it's amazing. So it's opinion per se, but you will enjoy every bit of it, I promise.
Yeah. I like the fact that, sorry, Nancy.
I was just going to say, we have a creative tension between gatekeeping and being more flexible, let's say. And I used to be a copy editor, so and a linguistics person. So I understand there's always this tension of, do we want it correct, or do we want it we want to slide around?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's an interesting thing as well, because your annotations are also online, as opposed to in the printed form, in the case of both, the work that Phil and Anastasia are working on. I mean, I guess this this isn't necessarily going to have an endpoint, is it, this project? Because you could keep finding stuff, or is that just too much to hope for?
Well, Ross assures us we're only on the hook for 7 years, so we shall see.
Then we'll have a 7-year itch.
I think that's perfectly legit. So tell me, is there anything that's, as you've been going through this and you've been pulling in the different opinions and the perspectives of different authors, are the things that have really surprised you, or you've discovered anything that's really leapt out as being a great discovery in the process of doing these annotations?
That's a great question. I think one of the things has been that occasionally we disagree with somebody's opinion, and we had a talk about a certain piece. I won't say which one it is, but it was, do we want to tell the author we don't think this is correct? And we decided, in some cases, in some ways, we're archiving other people's work on the story. So we're not necessarily guiding them or telling them what they should write. We've invited them to give their opinion. And so it sometimes, a couple times, it's been a little difficult to say, okay, we're not going to mess with this. We're going to print as is. And it's true. It's like this ongoing, never-ending story, right? This guy writes this. That's really cool. Maybe we should comment. Oh, wait, should we stick to the manuscript? So the plasticity of it is, because it's online and because it's real time, and because we've gone back a couple times and added things to pages that have already been, quote, published. So Margie is the one in charge of all of that, because I don't see it. She'll say, well, that's a left-hand comment. I'm like, okay, sure, that you go. And I can't see it till she builds it, and she builds all of it and then sends it to Ross. It's amazing. I don't know how you do it, but yeah,
I just organize. That's all. Just organize. I do like the fun part of being able to add to pages that we've already worked on, because just like Bob Katz's piece went back to the very beginning, when we're talking about what kind of state was Conan Doyle in at the time that he was writing this. And so yes, we are never finished, and it's perfectly okay, just in our little world, to keep adding to. And sometimes somebody who turned us down before will pop up and say, okay, I'm ready now. I say, okay, we're going back to page 2 because we need you to talk about X. And
right.
So we're lucky to be flexible that way. Now, if Ross ever decides he's going to make a book out of all this, which he has threatened, but we're not for sure yet, I'm not sure how that's all going to fit because it may be, 5,000 pages and nobody wants it. So we'll see what happens in 7 years. So,
Yeah.
no.
This is a bit of an in-joke, but it would be the House of Leaves of Sherlockiana. The House of Leaves.
So Phil, what about discoveries for you? I mean, you've looked at 12, now 13. Have you had any favorite sort of discoveries in that time?
Yeah. One thing that I do like doing is you don't want to reread Baring Gould, Klinger's, or the Oxford edition as I'm coming up with ideas. I don't want to cover the same stuff that they did, so I might excise a few things, a few thoughts of mine, but I try not to let their stuff influence what I'm going to. I try to expand on things, bring up new things or expand on things, but each time, most of the books I find there's something that's fun, that I feel is fun, and I hope that I can pass that along and other people feel it's the same thing. Like in the book The Wrong Passage, which dealt with Golden Pince-Nez, I found out that there is a New Age CD released in 2002 with a song titled Ionides of Alexandria, which is where the Coram got his cigarettes from.
Yeah.
Granted, I'm not that into New Age music, so I did not get a copy of the CD, but it's fun to find out about that. In the book Trenches, which dealt with his last bow, the manuscript in all but one of the sources set it to on the 2nd of August. Collier's, for some odd reason, I don't know, changed it to the 3rd of August. Also, Baron von Herrling, he was mentioned as being in a 100 horsepower Benz. Well, I was able to determine what the one and only 100 horsepower automobile manufacturer Benz Corporation at the time. This is before they merged with Mercedes, and we've got a picture of it in the book. So I felt that was fun and exciting. In The Worst Man in London, about Charles Augustus Milverton, there's the comment when they're preparing to go and burglarize the house, Milverton's house. Watson mentions that he has some tennis shoes. And I got to wondering, how old were tennis shoes? What happened there? I found contemporary reference from 1887 on somebody writing an article about how these shoes, they're so wonderful that they're kind of more vacation shoes. They can be used for lots of different things. So it explains, why Watson would have a pair for just holidays instead of playing tennis. And one last one I'll mention is in the Staunton tragedy about the missing 3/4. That was fun because I researched into the history of rugby and kind of gave an indication of where it came from, what it was like at the time that it was written, and how it's maybe changed a little bit, trying to explain rugby to the American audience.
Yeah.
And also letting the British audience know a bit of the history of it at the time. Also, that was fun because I did a very deep dive into telegrams. And it's amazing what information's online, including some of the manuals that telegraph operators in London had of how they took in things, how it was sent out, trying to gel that down enough that it can be put in an essay form for people.
Yeah.
But just it's all fun. It's a labor of love. And hopefully other people enjoy it too.
Yeah, it's great, and I think it enriches our appreciation of the text, particularly in Sherlock Holmes stories, which always have that really very immediate quality. It really does feel like it's a very real world. To then have that layer of additional information across the top, which just makes it even more real, is really fascinating. I was just thinking, Anastasia, you were talking before about punctuation and things like that you learn from looking at Conan Doyle's manuscripts. What do you feel you've learned anything else about Conan Doyle through looking actually at the manuscripts that survive? Do we get closer to him as a writer?
Well, excuse me. I feel like this is a good place to make a joke that clearly he was not a very good doctor because his handwriting was much too neat and much too readable. You know, the kind of stereotype that doctors have terrible handwriting. When I was originally asked to do this by Ross, I said, well, I'm not very good at reading handwriting. And he said, look at his Doyle's handwriting and then call me back. And I called him back and I said, okay, fine, because it's very legible. So it's interesting in that the punctuation is bad. So it feels like, you know, he was writing the story as a story came to him. And but he wasn't scribbling. He wanted to kind of set it down so that it was legible, so that he could read it and the printer could read it and the publisher could read it and whatnot. So there's almost a kind of like meticulousness to it that I felt, which to me is very interesting given what we know about all of the, well, plot holes, let's say, inconsistencies in so much of the canon. With all of which is to say, he is a mystery, he is a paradox.
Well, it's fascinating you should say that about the sort of the inconsistencies in the canon. When I was looking at one of the Gerard manuscripts, I was surprised that he'd gone back and he'd corrected something that he'd realized was historically inaccurate. And I thought, I'm not sure he would have done that with quite the same diligence with the Sherlock Holmes stories. But look, we're coming up to the half hour, and I think this has been really fascinating. I just want to say thank you to our panel because, well, not just for joining us today, but actually for the work that you do, because I think annotations is such a rich part of the Sherlockian Doylean scholarship, and every single piece that comes out, you know, enriches our understanding of this stuff. So, you know, congrats to the four of you, and carry on the excellent work. And I'm going to hand over to Ashley for our second half.
Thank you very much, and I love that. I love the archival work here, but we're going to shift tracks and we're going to talk about adaptation now, which is right in my wheelhouse. I'm very pleased to welcome on our interview guest today, Charles Kindinger. Charlie is a writer and executive producer of the Audible original podcast series, Moriarty, The Devil's Game. The series starred Dominic Monaghan as Moriarty and Billy Boyd as Sebastian Moran. It was released in June. If you've listened to this incredible 10-part series that radically reimagines Professor Moriarty's story, you already know how amazing his adaptation of Conan Doyle's characters is. If you haven't, you're going to want to download it and start listening as soon as this meeting ends. Listen to the whole meeting, then go and download it. Welcome to the Literary Agents, Charlie.
Thank you for having me. This is a true honor. I always love meeting the people that really appreciate the work that has gone into this. I wrote it originally. I was trying to write it obviously for a wider audience. I always like to say, like, so that my mom would understand and like enjoy the story, but really deep down, I wanted to be faithful to the canon and make sure that while perhaps taking Holmes in a different direction than normal, I was showing as much respect as possible to the canon. And it's interesting that we were talking about annotations, because I have a lot myself. I have the Baron's Gould here, and I even have done my own annotations in Ashley's book here. One of the first books on Holmes I was ever given by my wife, just when I got the deal to do the show. So this is a real honor. Long way of saying thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Thank your wife for me for the royalty check. So we're going to get into talking about the process a little bit, but before we do that, not everybody here, I'm sure, has listened to the podcast. Shame on you if you haven't, but some of them probably haven't. Could you give us like a little summary of the approach of what the story is?
Yeah, the story really takes Professor Moriarty before the events of the final problem and kind of paints him as an innocent man that's wrongly accused of a crime, a murder, by Sherlock Holmes. And he ends up, much like the fugitive, becoming a criminal to clear his own name. And that's essentially, which leads to the events of the final problem, which was kind of always that was the genesis of the idea. So that's a very short pitch, but basically Moriarty's the good guy and just misunderstood.
Misunderstood villain. So I guess to start with, how familiar were you with Conan Doyle's writing, the home canon, but any of Conan Doyle's writing really, before you began writing Moriarty?
Very. Yeah, my first exposure, I like to say, was with the PBS show Wishbone. I don't know how familiar people are with that. The Hound of the Baskervilles, they did an adaptation of that with Wishbone, the talking dog who, it went through literary masterworks and kind of like reimagined them for children. And from there, I started absorbing the short stories as much as I could in my youth, and really fell in love with it. I think I read almost all of them before college. And then of course, when I was in college, the Robert Downey Jr. movies came out, the BBC Sherlock became a thing. And so it just reignited my passion. And I got through the entire canon once. And so I was pretty familiar with all the work. It's a lot to read, but over 20 years you can get there. So yeah, before coming into this, and really it was my reading of the work that kind of sparked the idea in the first place.
So it was an idea that you came up with, you pitched it? Is that how the—
Yeah. I was reading the final problem again, and there's this passage at the beginning where Sherlock is talking to Watson, and he's like, "I've been on this case for 3 months, and I found my intellectual equal." And I was like, that sounds really interesting. Why didn't Doyle write about that? Instead, we get kind of just like this very exciting end to the story, but like there seems to be a lot of like it just implied this cat and mouse kind of game that kind of went unseen. And one of my big loves about the canon is all the untold stories and little like throwaway lines of like, oh, that would be really interesting. I wish he would have gone into that a little bit more. We could have, had some more color there. And as a writer, I often find myself just daydreaming then from those little moments, those little gaps in the canon, if you will. And that's kind of where the story began. I'm like, this is a really interesting story, but I want to know more. And for someone that's basically, I've kind of pitched him as like the Voldemort of the Sherlockian universe. Moriarty is supposed to be like the big bad, right? He's barely in it. The entire canon, he's very sparse. And I just thought, okay, there's more here to explore, and that's kind of what got the creative ball rolling for me.
That's the fundamental impulse for all of us, is the gap,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's what the game is played in the gaps, so filling in the historical context. Annotating is about finding the gaps and filling in the context, and adapting in a lot of ways is the same thing. I mean, you're right. Conan Doyle basically gave you nothing to work with in terms of Moriarty. I mean, Watson doesn't even meet him, right? And he's supposedly Holmes's great nemesis. So where does your Moriarty come from, since Conan Doyle didn't give you the character all fleshed out?
Yeah, I mean, I went into the canon and I tried to pull out as much as as we're given to kind of like root him in his studies. Obviously, like we talk about the binomial theorem and dynamics of an asteroid plays a big part in our show, and then what he kind of spins off into next. So I tried to root him as much as I could in the canon, and even like giving his brother has this, which, by the way, why does his brother also name James? I changed the name to JJ just because like we needed a different name for the character in the show, but like what was up with that? But really, yeah, it started there as just like he was just a humble professor. We knew he was a math professor, and we knew he had done these great works, and that was really the starting point. And then like I said, I leaned heavily on a lot of the tropes in The Fugitive to kind of like build out a little bit more of his character. I always loved that movie growing up, and I really just felt like, what if I was really interested in him becoming this criminal mastermind, but like, how do we get there? And I thought, well, if you want a compelling character arc, we got to start him at the exact opposite, which is innocent and naive and aspirational and thinking his work is going to change the world for the better. And then he ends up using his mind for crime. I thought that was really compelling. So basically, you start at the end and then you kind of reverse engineer who is the most unlikely hero to kind of take that journey, and yet we still wanted to root for him and be on his side, you know, along the way. So
yeah, it's very interesting. I could imagine some people who are more purists listening to the podcast and going, well, this isn't the thing that I know. But interestingly, if you look at all the adaptations that use Moriarty as a character, which a lot of them do because it's a familiar, you know, nemesis, they don't include the mathematics professor stuff very much. Yeah. And it's actually the one thing we really know about him from Conan Doyle. So you could argue yours is the most faithful Moriarty.
I'll take it. I always figured math was going to be his superpower, you know, much like Sherlock Holmes uses his mind. The mathematics was always very important because, like, how are you going to use, how is an innocent math teacher going to, you know, prove his innocence? Well, he's going to use the one skill he has that they can't take away from him, which is his mind. And because he's a mathematical genius, he ends up using his mind and math to solve problems, to solve a crime, to take on Sherlock Holmes, and yeah, it felt very organic and obvious to me. I'm surprised, you know, other adaptations don't lean in as heavily. I know the second Robert Downey Jr. movie, Game of Shadows, has a really interesting scene in the college between the two of them, and you kind of get a glimpse into the math of it all. But again, they went in a different direction. So
yeah, for you, it's the major plot point, which I love. Yeah. How much math research? This is totally off topic, but how much research did you have to do to make the math make sense?
Well, I did a lot, actually. I did a lot of Googling. Well, I really wanted, it started with, okay, I knew dynamics of an asteroid was going to be kind of like the kernel of the idea for whatever it is. And again, in the canon, it's not really explained what that is. We just know it's very mind-blowing to everyone at the time, right? And so there are theories out there on the internet and in you know, adaptations that, or annotations, I should say, that kind of like what it could be. And it kind of got me thinking about okay, there's what could it be? And then it led me to chaos theory, which was a thing that was, the elements of chaos theory were being developed around that time in the 1890s, even though chaos theory won't really become a thing until the 1960s. I thought, well, this guy's a mathematical genius, so he probably figures it out, you know, 50 years before everybody else. And that's what makes him so special and why people might want his work so badly. But yes, then I had to figure out, how do I explain that to you know, an audience without getting overly mathematical about it? And that's where like the butterfly effect comes in, and people seem to be familiar with that concept. And it's just from a thematic standpoint, very interesting to me, like how like the smallest little thing could create a huge ripple and change your life forever. I think that's really true to life, you know, for all of us. You know, the chance meeting, you might meet your spouse, you might narrowly miss a car accident or whatever, and that could just, your life changes drastically from one little, you know, thing, much like the details that Holmes is always looking for. It's those small little pieces that make all the difference. And so it got me really excited about.
I love that. Yeah, I learned. And it's not easy to include that kind of dense material in, you know, without becoming overly expositional. I mean, you have to keep the story going. So
yes,
well done on that. Let's talk about your homes a little bit. Because,
okay, yeah.
because we obviously, Conan Doyle gives us a lot of Sherlock Holmes, and your Sherlock Holmes is very different. Yes. But still makes sense. I mean, you can read him that way because you've explained it in terms of a kind of internal world building, and that he's inhabiting a character for the public. But he may win the prize for the least pleasant Sherlock Holmes I've ever heard.
Yeah, and I spent a lot of sleepless nights. My producers can attest. I'd call them in the morning and be like, "Man, they're gonna hate this. They're gonna barbecue over this." And I have been in some of the reviews, but that's again why it was important to get a lot of other canon stuff right. But what it came down to is taking some of the elements of Sherlock Holmes that we do in the canon, maybe some of the more negative aspects, his personality, and just put them, shifting them to in a darker, terrible direction. I know there's been a lot of talk about how he views women. I think that was even how he views Watson at times. There is like some, the way he treats people around him. I always liked how he had a riding crop with him, and I was like, he has to use that to beat people. And yeah, so really, it started with again the canon and just being like, where can we push what's already there, and then at the same time, yes, have this public persona that the world knows him to be the Holmes that we all love, and yeah, that was, I knew it was a risk, but if you're going to make Moriarty the good guy, you probably got to make Sherlock Holmes at least some sort of antagonist. So yeah, a risk, but I'm glad people have kind of responded positively.
Yeah, I buy it. You really don't want Sherlock Holmes to win at the end. You're like,
Yeah.
oh, the closer they get to the material of the final problem, as we get to the last episode, the more it starts to coalesce with the Conan Doyle material. But by that point, you really don't want you don't want the outcome to be what Conan Doyle wrote. So yeah, that's quite the feat. You have absorbed the canon since childhood. How important was it to you to keep Conan Doyle's voice in your work, even as you were working, with different versions of the characters?
Very, very important. I have with me, I brought visual aids. So this is one of my four binders full of quotes, and I went through many of the stories that I knew we were going to be pulling from, and there's quotes that I thought, if not taken word for word, could be like in spirit used, because the writing, I think one of the things that makes the story so great is the writing itself, right? The repartee between characters and the turns of phrases. And I was like, we can't lose that. And there was a time when some people, not me, wanted to make it modern day. And I'm like, well, that would we would lose so much of that, that Victorian charm, if you will, if we were to make it modern day. So so it was really important to me, is the short answer. And I really did go in, and I have a lot of quotes in there that are pulled directly from the canon, word for word, or very closely repurposed for our uses, perhaps in a different context. But it was really important because again, I think my first worry and hope was to serve the people that really love these stories. Because if we can't, if the diehard fans don't love it, then we're dead in the water. Was always kind of my thought. And the closer we came to Conan Doyle and his work and his world, the better, especially when we were taking such a drastic swing with some of the character choices, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's almost like you can justify the change in the Sherlock Holmes character as long as everything else is a stable foundation.
Exactly. Like we were just going to twist a few things, but we wanted it to feel familiar enough so that people would buy in and be along for the ride and enjoy the ride. And that was very important to us, for sure.
Yeah, the canonical Easter eggs, for those of you who have not listened yet, you're going to love listening in for the quotations. And I especially love finding a moment where you hear a line and you're like, ah, but that's not the character who says that line in Conan Doyle, but it totally makes sense in this other context here. It's a wonderful puzzle kind of that you've put together. It's like you took apart the puzzle and you put it back together, and it come up with a different picture, but it all still fits together. So bravo to you.
Thank you.
Do you think you're going to return to Sherlock Holmes in any future projects? Do we have anything else Sherlockian to look forward to from you?
I certainly hope they allow us to make more of these. We kind of, for those of you that have gone through it, we leave the door open for more stories in this universe, in the Moriarty verse, if you will. And we have more. I have more stories to tell, and I would love to tell them. I also would love to tell them from Sherlock's point of view. I don't know if anyone here has a direct line to the people that make the movies. I would love to take a swing at that third Sherlock Holmes movie. I think, there's a lot to do there, a lot to explore. And now that the public domain, the last of them have come into the public domain, there's more stories to tell or to draw from there. I think that was a big thing for us. We had to be very careful about which stories we pulled from. There were some characters that had to change, names that had to change, places that had to change because the lawyers got involved, and apparently the estate is very litigious.
Yes.
So we had to. I think Charlotte, for example, was one. She was supposed to be Kitty Winter originally. Yeah.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, and that got squashed because we came out a year too early. So yeah,
that's fascinating. And now that you say that, of course I see that. Of course it makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. I'd be interested to know what some of those other things were, because we are now celebrating. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully I'll be able to use them now, in sequels or other installations of the stories. I'm hoping, fingers crossed, I have a good feeling we're going to get to do more stories, but nothing official yet.
Well, if you want the Sherlock Holmes people to do a letter writing campaign, you let me know.
I just would love it if people, if you like it, check it out. If you dig it, give it a good review. That goes wonders. In Audible's world, all about listens and the data, and they love that kind of stuff. But yeah, I wanted to say, what else did I have? Oh, the other thing, I don't know if big for me, just before we get into questions, was the Moran of it all. I don't know if you've I don't know how much this group has looked into Moran, but like another character that's very sparse, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And barely mentioned. And very early on, I was like, okay, we need to know more about this guy. And there's a whole backstory that we actually had to cut from the final product. But we needed, like Sherlock has a Watson, Moriarty needed a Moran to talk to work things out with, to go on these adventures with. And that was another big thing for me, was exploring that character. And I felt like, because there's not a lot there, again, just it's a writer's dream to be like, here's a few tidbits, here's a thing about an air gun, and away you go. And again, it was just wonderful.
Yeah, he's a great character. It's interesting. He's also a character that's been picked up by the BBC Sherlock fandom, because that program put Moran in, and I think it was season 3. Was it season 3? And the fandom just went, nope, we don't like your version, and they just totally invented a completely different version of the character. So if you read like fan fiction for the show, they have a uniform, recognizable Moran character that is completely and absolutely not the character that was written into the show, because they wanted that character to exist, and they wanted it to be much more like the character you created than the one that the BBC folks created. So yeah, it's finding those threads where it's just a little edge and pulling at it That's the dream.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. Well, we have, I guess, about 10 minutes maybe, if we want to take some questions from folks for Charlie here.
Yeah, there's a few in the chat there. I'll just, one of them here for Charles is, did you write with Dominic Monaghan in mind?
Yeah, so we pitched the show. Dominic got on board very early. So yes, I was writing with him in my head. Billy Boyd was not. And there's a reason that Moran's a Scottish character in the show, and that's because the original actor we had was going to be Scottish. So not a canonical mistake on my part. We were kind of writing in that direction, and at the last minute, Billy came in instead, who happens to be very good friends with Dominic. And but yeah, Dominic was the only one that we definitely had in mind. Everybody else was just voices in my head.
There's another
I love
one
having
here.
a Scottish Moran.
Yeah. I was just thinking, it doesn't really necessarily hold you back, does it, with who you originally had to cast? Because I mean, Sean Connery plays a Spanish Egyptian in Highlander. He's the only person
And
who
we're
isn't
just having
Scottish.
fun here, you know.
There's another question here. We got one from Madeline, which is the first series features several canon stories quite prominently. If there's a second season, would there be more of that, or would you go even further in an original direction?
I think there's a balance. Well, one of the great things about our show is that, like, we have different characters that don't necessarily have to tie too closely into the canon, but I again want to be faithful as much as possible. And obviously there are other stories where Moriarty is mentioned, and I would say they have been thought about as potentially the basis for adaptations for other stories for a second season. I'm of course referring to the Valley of Fear.
Coming to America.
I think it would be fun. I think it would be fun. A new world to explore. Yeah, and I think that for us, we always we want to tell original stories in a very familiar space. Has always kind of been our North Star. So as much as we can, we're going to try to pull in familiar characters from the canon, although we exhausted a lot of them in the first season, at least of the big ones that everyone knows. But there are more out there that I love and hope to visit. But the way that Moriarty interweaves with them may not be necessarily canonical. So.
Excellent. Are there any other questions from the chat, Mark?
There's a few. I'm just having a look in here. There's a question from Monique about would you make any changes or have anything in mind for the character of Watson? Let's have a look. Yeah, there was a question there about the 7% solution, which you might be familiar with, Charles, and that's the kind of first. Is that the kind of first good Moriarty? I think it probably is, isn't it, Ashley?
Yeah, I you know. Oh, go ahead. I haven't seen it, and I was very, in the research part of it, I was very intentional about steering away from too many other adaptations because you want to do your own thing. You don't want to copy someone else's work. And I was always trying to find a fresher way. I'm sure there's overlap though, because if you start with the pitch that Moriarty is the good guy, and after the fact, I went and watched it, and yes, there's plenty of overlap. But it wasn't something I was aware of while writing the show.
I'm just wondering, are there any other villains in the canon that you think you would be tempted to give a new lease of life to?
I'll give you guys a little hint of one that I might be thinking about right now. Does everybody else have this one?
Oh,
This one came in the other day for me. I think he might be up there in the people that I'd like to explore, Mr. Milverton, and yeah, but I'd love to hear from you all. Who do you find interesting and compelling? Because again, like I feel like I'm familiar with the canon, but I am by far not a Sherlockian scholar. So I'm taking pitches.
Well, I had one other question with you, which was just about the reaction that you've had.
Yeah.
To, you know, how's it been? And you know, audible dramas are still relatively new. I mean,
Yeah.
radio dramas aren't, but you know, audible dramas are still a relatively new thing. I mean, what are you pleased with the reaction, and how's it been?
Yeah, well, no one's set my house on fire yet. But yeah, I would say the reaction has been really positive. From what I can tell, and I try not to read the reviews too much because as the creator, it's a lot of, you know, it can be very uplifting, but also soul crushing at the same time. Because the one bad review wipes out any good reviews, right? So I try not to look too much, but what I'm told is that it's very positive, and that very important to me is the people listen all the way through. So like if you can get them through the first episode, people seem to listen all the way through, which is always good. As a storyteller, that's what you're going for. And yes, we've been lucky enough to be mentioned on some top 10 lists. And I know I was told the other day, we're still in the top 20 of their Audible's kind of like original material list, which is crazy because as you said, the thing came out 6 months ago. I can't believe people are still listening to it. But yeah, everyone, you know, my mom likes it, so that's what really
Yeah,
it's validated a lot for my life choices. Finally, it took about a decade and a half, but being a writer finally is paying off.
You've got a suggestion in the chat there that one of the villains that would be a good one to do is Abe Slaney from the Dance.
Oh yeah.
And if you're going to be doing something set in America, there's a good bit of overlap there you could do as well.
Mm-hmm. And Madeline also suggested, since Charlotte is a Kitty Winter avatar, having her take on Baron Gruner is good. He's such a good canonical slime ball.
Yes. There's plenty of them to choose from. Yeah.
That's great.
Fantastic. Do we have any other questions? I think that kind of covered the questions that were in the chat. I did put the link to the podcast through Audible in the chat, so you can find that there if you want to. If you haven't already downloaded it, so you can go and do that. I'm going to start my third listen through on the flight home from New York, because it gets richer every time you listen to it when you know what's coming up. So highly recommended. And we're certainly going to look forward to whatever they have you do next, Charlie. We hope it's Sherlockian, but even if it's not, we'll be listening.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And we're hitting our 11:30 mark, which is our wrap up here. Thank you all for coming to our third annual Literary Agents meeting. And thank you all for coming with us on the time change. I know that we've been doing this on Sundays, but hopefully the Friday morning is going to be our new home here for the Literary Agents. And we will see you next year. Stay tuned for who our panelists will be and who our guests will be and what our topics will be. As soon as Mark and I figure it out, we'll let you know.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, everyone. This was
Thanks
wonderful.
to our panel.
Thank you.
See you later.